No, that's a great question, and I'm smiling because as I've put in the paper, we've got one officer who spends the vast majority of their time managing and monitoring that contract at the moment, and that's something that we want to move away from by having an improved specification, an improved contract, as Julie said, with things woven into it, key performance indicators, so that we can hold the contractor to account if their performance isn't meeting our requirements moving forward. So we will have a whole range of things in place to ensure that we can manage and monitor the contract moving forward. So that includes we've got a WhatsApp group with the contractor. We're asking the contractor, as Julie mentioned, to have some digital interaction with our residents, so they can give easy feedback on the standard of cleaning in their block of flats. We also will be wanting regular meetings, particularly at the beginning of the contract, with the contractor, so that we're quite clear that they're delivering on the specification on the contract. So we'll have a whole suite of measures to manage that contract, but I'm hoping it's not going to be as resource intensive for that particular member of staff, and they can get on and do some other things that they'd really like to get to grips with.
Thank you so much.
And can I just ask a supplementary on the back of that question? I know you're one of your recommendations you're asking for approval is we do a 3-year contract, then with the opportunity to extend for 2 years. To what extent, if we find after a year that all the promises made, all the key performance indicators, despite all the monitoring, it's still not coming up to scratch, what recourse would we have to give our tenants the service that they require?
I guess, as Mrs. Russell's just said, there is a whole suite within the specification, within the contract documents, that we can go through remedial action and mediation. But if at the end of the day the contract is not performing and we cannot see a way forward, then as with every contract, we are able to terminate if we wanted to do that, and we would have to go back out to re-procure again. But there is always that final option. But I'm hoping that everything that we have in place will prevent that from happening. And also, just going back to the key performance indicators, they will change with time. So as you know, we've also spoke about very much about supporting the climate change emergency. If we can work collaboratively with the provider to be able to put extra things in place, and that may well be something that becomes a key performance indicator. So they will very much change during the contract term as well. But coming back to it, we always have the option to terminate any contract if we wanted to.
So both, and did you want to add anything? You gave me a meaningful glance.
Sorry, Chair, no, that's all fine at the moment, thank you.
So that was just a meaningful glance, just for me. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, I don't want to labour the point, but I have sat in TAC meetings for the last few years, and there's been a huge dissatisfaction with the contract. So I am questioning, should we allocate it for 3 years? Because there's always a very good promise at the beginning, and it goes okay for a few months, and then it goes horribly wrong. I don't read anything differently in this paper that says that it talks about KPIs and the like, but we have those now. We have people who are spending a good deal of their time, perhaps more time than we should do in the housing team, monitoring this and addressing the issues. So it's all in that negative context. So my question is, should we allocate for 3 years, or should we allocate for a lesser time so that we have choice? And if they're good, we endorse, and if we don't, we have options. My question is 60/40 sufficient leverage? I see the tenants don't want to pay more, but they constantly say the quality is not good enough. And my third part of that is, what is really going to happen in monitoring that means it will be different? Because if Mrs. Russell wants to draw back some of her staff intervention, What are we going to have that guarantees for the TACT group and the tenants that we really do have a contract here that we can be assured will deliver for us? Highly emotive area, even though the contract sum is still relatively small versus many that we will allocate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Horrell. To start with your first question, then the actual term, so a 3+2 is what we're considering. Again, when we've spoken to the market, that did seem to be very much what they preferred. So we did put other options out there, some longer, some shorter, some breaking them up. But I think for them to invest in the service that we are seeking for our residents, so that to be, one, very cost effective, but two, to be able to put that level of quality and to support our climate change emergency, then 3 years seemed to be the term that they also preferred. And I think if we also want to invest in it from a just a council point of view and to work collaboratively with the provider and for our residents to be able to have their input too, then I think a reasonable period of time is 3 years to be able to do that. But we always have options to pull it forward if we wanted to. But I think I understand what you're saying about previous contracts are perhaps not performed as you wanted them to, but I think perhaps we need to go in with something, as we do want to be collaborative and to be able to get the best out of this contract that we can do. So 3 years does seem to be the term that people are asking for, but it is a recommendation.
So just following on from Councillor Horrell's question, I know there are other elements that haven't been addressed, so I will come back to those. Are we able to put a break clause in the contract, even if it was allowed for 3 years?
It's something that we could consider doing, but again, it would come down to poor performance, and it will be allowed for in the contract anyway if they're not performing and they have not kept within the clauses that are set out in the contract, that we could look to terminate anyway. So I'm not quite sure whether we'd need a break clause, but that's certainly something to discuss with our legal colleagues about that.
Thank you. The other question Councillor Horrell makes, and again, I'm very aware, and I would like to give Mr. Light an opportunity to speak next, is this idea that, you know, we already have performance indicators, we already monitor the contract, but we still have levels of dissatisfaction, particularly in our general schemes. You've talked, Ms. Russell, about how the contractor themselves will be monitoring performance and doing that engagement. That's obviously at arm's length. How do we see that as an enhancement, and what additionality are we putting in place apart from those digital surveys? Thank you.
So yeah, the digital service is a new thing at the moment. We display how people can make complaints, but it's very ad hoc. And what we're putting in the contract this time is that the contractor has to provide a solution for getting constant feedback from residents throughout the whole of the contract, and consulting with all residents. So like what happens on other contracts that I manage. So we are constantly getting that feedback, good and bad, about contractor performance. The other thing that came from the resident feedback, which we're transferring into our documentation, is around tenants as well wanting to meet with the contractor face to face on a very regular basis. And they came up with some really great ideas about having champions at schemes or blocks. So that's again something that we're looking to include. These are all new things in the spec and the contract that we haven't had previously. I take fully on board your points around we've got key performance indicators at the moment, and we've got monitoring in place. But I would say it's probably not as robust as it needs to be, and those KPIs probably aren't as fine-tuned as they need to be for
Yeah, if I could just add as well that the contract is very much tailored to this service, whereas before, I believe a JCT contract was used, which was suitable for cleaning, but it's also used for construction as well. So we've worked really closely with the officers within the housing team to understand what they want, what have been the problems from the last contract, and how we can try to mitigate those going forward.
Thank you very much. Mr. Light, is there anything you would like to ask on this?
Yeah, only that my daughter worked for YBC, but she worked in the fire station, not with this lot. And I have seen their WhatsApp page, and they are not very good at knowing where they get their cleaning supplies from, etc. So I'd like to see. There is dissatisfaction with the workers, so I'd like to see some improvements in another contract. So, and we've also had a lot of complaints, as was said, by TAC members. Thank you.
So I think really the question there, and I think it is covered in the papers, but it might be one to reiterate here. You know, we can take on a contractor who makes the promises, all the monitoring. To what extent are we also going to be asking them to look after their own workforce, you know, so that on paper it looks like they're doing everything right, but in practice it's not necessarily the case. So what are we doing to help them around that issue?
We clearly, I mean, it's a standard clause anyway, but the living wage has to be paid for, you know, we have to pay for living wage. I'm not sure that's quite the right wording, but anyway, living wage is an absolute must. Secondly, we ask about retention. We ask about what training is done. There is a whole point about modern slavery into the tender documents as well. So we do quite a lot of looking into up front as to how the potential service provider looks after their workforce and how they recruit. But then, yes, it would be something that we'd have to look at also going forward as part of our due diligence anyway.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, committee. So if there's nobody with a very pressing question, Councillor Gordon-Smith, I think you must be not able to give me the same meaningful looks that Mr. Berthing gives me. Do you have one more question?
Not so much a question, but dealing with service quality issues and the number of emails I get about the state of the public toilets, I would emphasise the importance of having robust monitoring as much as you can and keeping the contractor up to scratch. We all know people start off with really good intentions, you know, and then it sort of starts to slide and et cetera, So I would emphasise the importance of that. And we've obviously thought about it, but it has to be robust as possible.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon-Smith. I was about to move into debate, so we'll take that as the first part of our debate. Are there any other comments that other councillors would like to make in debate? Councillor Horan.
Thank you, Chair. I think Mr. Light's already reiterated this, but I think it's probably the area that is most mentioned in TAC meetings over time as one of the sort of dissatisfactions with the service on the whole. They love where they live. They just don't think we always look after it as well as we might. So the question of the monitoring and the monitoring by the contractor, I think, is absolutely fundamental. I think you've probably heard today from us the importance of that based on the experiences that we've heard from the tenants. And also whether you've got sufficient flexibility in the contract. I hear what the contractor would like, but maybe our lesson for us is that we need more flexibility in how we might maneuver this contract if we're not satisfied going forwards. So maybe 3 years isn't quite excuse me, quite the right level, and we want some element of a break clause included. But I wish you well in the negotiation, and I'm sure it will be well scrutinised when it comes into force. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Horrell. And before we move to the recommendations, again, I'd just like to thank the team for the work that's gone into putting this paper together to get us to the procurement phase. We know this is high profile. You've made that very clear. It's high profile not only for our tenants because it affects their, their community, the way they live, their homes, but it's also high profile for us as a council in making sure we maintain our housing stock well, and particularly those where we have sort of shared entrances, shared facilities. I'm pleased the level of involvement that's gone into this process so far in terms of the survey for tenants and leaseholders. The procurement process that we're proposing does allow that involvement to continue. So they will be on the panel. Equally, leaseholders will have the chance to nominate potentially a preferred provider. I think I'm right in saying that. I am slightly concerned about giving someone a 3-year contract, which they may then, as everyone others have said, promise the world but deliver something very, very different. But I'm also persuaded by your answers that we do have clauses in the contract that if they perform well below the standards expected, they're not meeting their KPIs, and we do have an option to terminate that contract prior to that 3-year period. The extension, I believe, is on both sides. The provider could seek to terminate. We could also seek to terminate that contract. So on that basis, I'm actually happy to go forward with the recommendations. So Cabinet colleagues, Councillor Power and Councillor Gordon-Smith, we have 6 recommendations. I will run through them quickly. It'd be agreed that the current cleaning contract to YBC cleaning services should not be extended for a further 1-year period, that the procurement of a cleaning service using an open tender procedure be authorised in accordance with the Council's contract procedure rules and the Public Contract Regulations 2015, PCR 2015, that to ensure best value for residents, tenders are to be evaluated based on a criteria of 60% cost, 40% quality, and 10% of that quality criteria will be allocated to environmental and social value matters. Recommendation 4, that the strategic director be authorised to award the contract to the preferred bidder, this being the applicant with the most economically advantageous tender to a term of 3 years, with an option to renew for up to further 2 years based on performance of service provision. Recommendation 5, that the strategic director be authorised to enter into all necessary agreements with the preferred contract to provide a building cleaning service within the common and communal areas of the council's housing stock. And finally, recommendation 6, that delegated authority be granted to the service legal to execute and enter into all necessary contractual agreements. Do I have your agreement?
Agreed.
Thank you. Right, we will now move on to, according to the agenda, we are done. I only have one final item, which is to thank the committee today for all of your comments, questions, discussion. Again, to thank officers for all the work they've put into the presentations and the papers today. And to remind members that we next meet on February the 2nd for our next meeting. And thank you very much, everybody. That's the meeting closed.